At the Beaumont, one of Los Angeles' most exclusive restaurants, everyone knew one thing: when Victoria Harrington walked through the door, chaos followed. For years, the staff endured her cruelty in silence until the night a new hire, Alyssa Parker, refused to bow. That single act of defiance would shatter the restaurant's fear, expose long-hidden truths, and change every life inside those walls. At the Beaumont, one of Los Angeles' most sought-after dining rooms, the evening rhythm could shift in an instant. Some nights unfolded with the effortless grace of a well-rehearsed symphony, servers gliding between tables, sommeliers discussing vintages with polished charm, chefs sending out plates like small works of art. But there was one name capable of breaking that rhythm, one name that, the moment spoken, tightened shoulders and sharpened breaths: Victoria Harrington. Long before her black Cadillac Escalade even turned down Fairfax Avenue, the staff felt the change in the air. It was as if the temperature dropped a few degrees, as if the golden light of the chandeliers dimmed slightly, as if the restaurant itself braced for impact. People swore the walls could sense her coming. Every evening at the Beaumont began with predictable rituals: polishing silverware, adjusting table spacing to perfection, smoothing crisp white tablecloths. But on nights when Victoria's reservation appeared on the schedule, those rituals intensified into something more like preparation for a storm. Servers double-checked not just table settings but each other's uniforms. Bartenders aligned their bottles precisely by label. The maitre d' rehearsed greetings under her breath, trying to strike an impossible balance between respect and caution. Even the head chef, a two-time James Beard Award finalist who'd cooked for celebrities without blinking, tightened his jaw whenever her name was mentioned. Victoria Harrington wasn't simply a wealthy woman with expensive tastes. Los Angeles had plenty of those. What made her different, what made her infamous, was the particular brand of destruction she brought with her. She treated the Beaumont not as a restaurant, but as a stage, and the staff as actors in a production she controlled. If a fork wasn't positioned at the angle she preferred, she noticed. If her sparkling water had one bubble too many, or her steak came out with grill marks half a shade darker than last time, she called attention to it. But the problem wasn't her standards. It was that she used those standards like weapons, slicing through anyone working within 10 feet of her. And she wielded them with precision. Her wealth came from her husband, Richard Harrington, the powerful developer behind luxury towers across California. The Harrington name alone meant the restaurant's owners tread carefully. The Beaumont might have been a hotspot for Hollywood elites, but the Harringtons had influence that went beyond celebrity clout. They had the kind of financial power that could quietly break businesses. Everyone knew that if Victoria decided the Beaumont no longer met her expectations, one phone call could put the entire establishment in jeopardy. That knowledge shaped the atmosphere around her like an invisible force field. Some employees tried to justify her behavior. She's just stressed, they whispered. She has high expectations. She's particular. But those excuses thinned out quickly once you experience Victoria firsthand. The seasoned staff members, those who had survived 3, 4, even 8 years at the Beaumont, learned a truth that newcomers didn't understand until it was too late. Victoria didn't simply complain. She dismantled. She searched for weaknesses, pushed buttons, exploited insecurities. Sometimes she acted offended by the smallest oversight. Other times she seemed almost bored until an opportunity presented itself to create tension. It wasn't about food or service. It was about control, dominance, and the peculiar satisfaction she found in watching seasoned professionals panic under her scrutiny. Take Becca, one of the restaurant's most reliable servers. She had an easy smile, a calm presence, and a reputation for making guests feel as if they were the only people in the room. But around Victoria, Becca fell apart. Her hands shook when she carried glasses. Her voice wavered when taking orders. Her usually warm confidence vanished, replaced by the tenseness of someone waiting for a blow they couldn't dodge. 3 months earlier, Victoria had humiliated her for nearly half an hour because the table's candle burned unevenly. She called over the manager, then the assistant manager, and created a spectacle large enough that guests from across the dining room turned to watch. Becca left the floor that night barely holding tears. She still winced whenever she heard the distinct click of Victoria's heels across the marble tiles. Then there was Marco, the lead sommelier. He could describe a wine like a poet: notes of black cherry, smoky oak, the faint trace of river stones but around Victoria. He became careful to the point of paralysis. Once, she accused him of fabricating a wine's origin because she insisted the flavor profile didn't match the vineyard he stated. He had been correct, but she didn't want correct. She wanted a reason to scold. He later admitted to a colleague that he never feared losing his job until the night she questioned his integrity. "She's not here for dinner," he said. "She's here for sport." Even the general manager, Dean Foster, a veteran of the hospitality industry who had handled Hollywood tantrums and political egos with ease, dreaded Victoria's visits. He prepped the staff like he was prepping them for a crisis drill, reviewing procedures, clarifying expectations, and emphasizing composure. But no amount of preparation could soften the blow when she decided someone wasn't worthy of her time. Dean's greatest fear wasn't Victoria insulting staff, it was the possibility of her escalating her displeasure to her husband. If Richard decided the Beaumont had disrespected his wife, there would be consequences, ones Dean wasn't sure the restaurant could withstand. The irony was that most guests at the Beaumont had no idea any of this was happening. The dining room looked flawless, golden lighting, velvet booths, glassware sparkling under crystal chandeliers. The staff were so skilled at maintaining their polished facade that the tension beneath barely showed. But if you looked closely, really closely, you could see it in the way servers subtly avoided table 14, Victoria's preferred spot. You could feel it in the way conversations quieted slightly when she entered. You could even sense it in the way the restaurant's music seemed too soft, as though the speakers themselves knew better than to overstimulate her. On the rare days when Victoria didn't show up, the staff felt like they were breathing properly for the first time in hours. Laughter came easier. Movement flowed naturally. The Beaumont felt like a place of luxury again, rather than a battlefield disguised as fine dining. But peace never lasted long, because the moment her name appeared again on the evening reservation list, everything returned to its uneasy rhythm. That was the environment Alyssa Parker would walk into, an environment shaped by fear, routine, and the invisible weight of one woman's power. No one at the Beaumont expected change. No one imagined that a single new hire could shift the balance they'd accepted for years. And certainly no one predicted that the next time Victoria Harrington walked through those double doors, the storm she brought would collide with someone unwilling to bend the way everyone else always had. A collision that would alter everything. If the Beaumont had a pulse, it always beat a little too fast on nights when Victoria Harrington was expected. And on one of those nights, one with a cloudless Los Angeles sunset glowing through the front windows, Beck Daniels stood at her station polishing cutlery for the 5th time, pretending her hands weren't trembling. She had worked at the Beaumont for 7 years, long enough to memorize the rhythms of every chef, every bartender, even the malfunctioning hum of the espresso machine in the back corner. But nothing unsettled her more than the sound of the host's stand phone lighting up with Victoria's reservation confirmation. Tonight, that glow stared at her like a warning. Becca's coworkers kept glancing her way, offering small encouraging smiles, though none of them dared to say what they were all thinking. She shouldn't be the one serving Victoria again. But schedules were schedules. 2 servers had called out sick, one had a family emergency, and another had asked to work the patio section, claiming she had a sunlight deficiency. Everyone knew it was an excuse, though no one could blame her. Victoria drained people, and not in the metaphorical sense. She found cracks in confidence and widened them with precision. Dean Foster, the general manager, gathered the staff near the bar for the pre-shift meeting. He held the seating chart like it contained state secrets. "Okay, team," he began, his voice steady but coated with underlying tension. "We have a fully booked dining room tonight. Table 8 is a birthday party. Table 12 is a celebrity couple, no photos, obviously," and he paused. Some of the newer staff perked up, anticipating something exciting. The veterans lowered their eyes. "Table 14 belongs to Mrs. Harrington." The room stiffened. Even the bartenders, halfway through restocking spirits, momentarily stopped. Dean didn't bother asking if everyone understood what that meant. He didn't have to. He simply adjusted his tie and moved on. "Becca, you'll take 14. Her stomach felt like it dropped through the floor. She nodded anyway, because nodding was easier than explaining why the thought of approaching that table made her chest tighten. The last time she served Victoria, she'd spent an entire evening trying not to cry in the walk-in refrigerator. Tonight she hoped to avoid that, though she wasn't optimistic. The other servers exchanged glances when Dean wasn't looking. Not one offered to switch sections with her. Not because they lacked empathy, they simply didn't have the courage to face what she would face. Becca couldn't fault them for that. She wished she didn't have to face it either. She sighed, set down the polished silverware and walked toward the service station. "It's okay," she whispered to herself. You know her routine. Don't get flustered. Stay focused. Just get through the night. But there was no comfort in saying it. She knew exactly how unpredictable Victoria could be. There were nights when she found flaws in everything: the garnish, the pacing, even the atmospheric music. And then there were the nights that frightened the staff the most. The ones when she lingered on the threshold of mockery, waiting for a misstep so small it barely existed. That was when she was at her most dangerous. Chef Adrian poked his head from the kitchen. "Becca, you good?" he asked, though his expression already showed the answer. He'd seen her like this before. He'd seen all of them like this. The pressure of fine dining was relentless. But the pressure of fine dining plus Victoria Harrington was something entirely different. "I'm fine," Becca lied. "I'll manage." "You always do," he replied gently, though worry colored his voice. She appreciated the sentiment, but it didn't change the fact that Victoria expected flaws and found them even when they didn't exist. By 7 p.m., the Beaumont had slipped into its usual elegant buzz. Guests filled tables with conversations ranging from real estate to movie deals to which Beverly Hills plastic surgeon was truly worth the hype. Champagne popped, laughter rose, and the distant rush of traffic hummed softly outside. Becca kept glancing toward the door, waiting. The clock ticked. Senders 05, Severs 09, 7:13. Too late. Victoria was rarely late. Dean hovered near the entrance, straightening his jacket, adjusting the host stand pens, realigning menace anything to channel his nerves. Even the lighting seemed to brace itself, casting warm golden hues across the room like a soft apology to anyone who would be caught in Victoria's path. At 7:14, the headlights appeared first, two sharp beams slicing across the floor to ceiling windows. A black Cadillac Escalade rolled to a perfect stop outside. The valet practically sprinted to the door. "She's here," someone whispered. The energy in the room shifted like wind changing direction. Victoria stepped through the entrance with the confidence of someone accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves for her comfort. She wore a fitted emerald dress, diamond earrings that caught the light with every step, and an expression carved from something colder than stone. Her gaze flickered across the restaurant, not in admiration but in assessment. She looked at the Beaumont as though she owned it, and in a way she did. Or at least she believed she did. Dean greeted her immediately, bowing his head slightly. "Mrs. Harrington, welcome back." She looked at her watch. "Table 14 better be ready. Last time I waited 5 minutes. Completely unacceptable." "It's ready, ma'am," Dean replied, keeping his tone even. "Right this way." Becca watched from across the restaurant, her heartbeat thudding in her chest. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and grabbed her order book. Her palms were already slick. The moment Victoria sat, she began nitpicking. "This chair is slightly uneven. Fix it. Why is the candle flickering? Replace it. This water isn't cold enough. Bring another." And that was before Becca even introduced herself. When she finally approached the table, she kept her posture steady, her expression neutral. "Good evening, Mrs. Harrington. May I start you with?" Victoria held up a hand without looking at her. "Stop talking." Becca froze. Victoria slowly lifted her gaze, eyes narrowing with the satisfaction of finding a target. "You again." Becca's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria leaned back. "Let's hope you've improved since last time, though my expectations are low." Becca clenched her order book behind her back, forcing herself to breathe through the sting. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to be anywhere but here. But she needed the job. Rent didn't care about emotions, and neither did the Beaumont's night shifts. She swallowed, nodded, and prepared to take the order. And that was when Dean caught sight of her trembling hand. He stepped closer, pretending to check on another table, but his focus was on Becca's fading composure. He'd seen servers wiped out by far less. If she cracked now, the night would spiral quickly, because Victoria never stopped at one blow. She escalated. Becca inhaled deeply and tried again. Mrs. Harrington, would you like to begin with? Do you ever listen? Victoria snapped. I said not to speak. Becca's stomach twisted. She pressed her lips together and stepped back. It was the breaking point. Dean exhaled sharply. He needed a solution, and fast. He scanned the room, searching for any server who might against all instincts take her place. That was when his gaze landed on a new face at the service station. Alyssa Parker. Fresh uniform, attentive posture, and no idea what monster she was about to encounter. Dean's breath caught. For better or worse, the night was about to change. Alyssa Parker had only been inside the Beaumont for half an hour, still adjusting her crisp apron and scanning the layout of the service stations, when she felt something was off. She wasn't Navi restaurants, always had tension hidden beneath the polished exterior, but the mood tonight felt sharper, denser, like the whole building was holding its breath. She noticed the way veteran servers moved with careful steps, the way bartenders avoided eye contact with table 14, and the way Dean's jaw clenched every time he glanced in that direction. Alyssa wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew enough to recognize fear when she saw it. And it wasn't fear of a busy night or a strict manager. This was the kind of fear people carried when dealing with a threat disguised as a customer. She had worked in rougher places before, diners on the east side, sports bars where drunk men pushed boundaries, small cafes where customers acted entitled, but nothing about tonight's energy felt familiar. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled dread. People didn't argue, they avoided. They didn't whisper, they monitored. It was as if everyone had built an invisible map of danger zones, and table 14 was clearly marked in red. While she wiped down a counter, Alyssa watched Becca from across the room. The woman's hands trembled just enough that the stemware she held nearly slipped. Her shoulders were tight, her posture rigid, and her expression carried the exhausted resignation of someone who had spent far too many nights bracing herself for an attack. Alyssa didn't know her well. They'd exchanged maybe 3 sentences since she arrived, but she could tell Becca was the kind of person who usually held herself together. Tonight, she looked ready to break. Alyssa's eyes shifted toward the woman seated at table 14. The expensive emerald dress, the perfect posture, the small but sharp movements, it all screamed entitlement. She didn't have to be introduced to know this woman was the source of the tension. It was obvious in the way nearby tables avoided looking directly at her, in the way Dean hovered around the perimeter like a nervous bodyguard, and in the way Becca flinched each time she stepped closer. Alyssa didn't know who the woman was, but she recognized cruelty when she saw it. She had seen different flavors of it throughout her life: teachers who mocked students, bosses who barked orders like commands, customers who treated workers like disposable napkins. But the woman at table 14 carried a different sort of confidence, not loud, not dramatic, calculated. She carried herself like someone who believed the world owed her subservience. Alyssa focused back on her task, but her attention kept drifting. Every time Becca returned to the service station, she looked worse. Her breathing came faster, her hands shook more. She wiped her forehead repeatedly. She fumbled receipts and apologized even when no one blamed her. Alyssa could feel the growing panic surrounding her, even if no one said a word. Dean noticed too. He kept pacing the front of the restaurant, glancing at Becca, then at table 14, then at the door, as if hoping someone else would walk through it and save him from a disaster waiting to happen. But no one came. And when Victoria snapped again, something about the water not meeting her exact preference, Becca's shoulders finally sagged, and Dean's decision was made. He scanned the room in desperation, looking for another server who wasn't already drowning in tables, someone calm enough to handle a high-maintenance guest. But everyone avoided his eyes. They all had their own battles to fight, their own tables to manage, and none wanted to face the hurricane waiting at table 14. Then Dean saw Alyssa. She stood near the bar with her notepad tucked under her arm, hair neatly pinned, posture steady. There was a quiet strength about her, not arrogance, not bravado, just a grounded presence. She reminded him of someone who had lived through worse things than a rude customer. A woman who had learned to cope with chaos rather than collapse under it. He hesitated for a heartbeat. It was her first day. She hadn't been trained on fine dining etiquette yet. She hadn't memorized the wine list. She didn't know Victoria's patterns. And throwing her into the fire like this felt wrong. But Becca looked ready to collapse, and there was no one else. Parker, Dean said softly. Alyssa turned, eyebrows raised. Yes, sir. He walked to her with the heaviness of someone making a choice he hated. I need your help. He glanced toward table 14. She followed his gaze and saw the emerald-dressed woman tapping her fingernail against the table, annoyed with the world. Becca can't continue, he explained. She's done all she can. I need someone else to step in. Alyssa blinked. For her. Dean nodded. I won't force you. It's your first night, and you have every right to say no. But his voice lowered. I can't send Becca back there. Alyssa looked at him, then at Becca, who stood with her head bowed, rubbing her palms together as if trying to steady her nerves. Alyssa could practically feel the woman's distress from across the room. Her own experiences in the restaurant world had sharpened her intuition. She could tell when a person had reached their emotional limit. Becca was beyond hers. Okay, Alyssa said, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. I'll take it. Dean exhaled with relief but also worry. She's particular, he warned. I noticed, Alyssa replied. Tell me what she ordered. She hasn't placed her order yet, Dean said. She's deciding how best to start the evening. Alyssa understood instantly. Victoria was playing games. She adjusted her apron, smoothed stray hair behind her ear, and straightened her posture. She wasn't fearless, her heart tapped hard in her chest, but she wasn't the kind of person who backed away from challenges either. Life had thrown worse at her. Bills overdue, childcare emergencies, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure of being responsible for another human being, all of that had forced her to develop skin thicker than most expected. She walked toward table 14, each step measured and calm. The lighting cast a warm golden glow on her as she approached, but the closer she got, the more she felt an icy wall of scrutiny rising from the woman waiting there. Victoria looked up, startled to see a new face. And who are you? She demanded, dripping annoyance. Alyssa offered a steady, polite smile. My name is Alyssa, I'll be taking care of you tonight. Victoria's brows lifted with disdainful amusement as her gaze scanned Alyssa's uniform, posture, and hands with surgical precision. Where's the other one? She asked. The one who was trembling. Alyssa didn't look away. Another server will be handling other tables tonight. I'll be assisting you. Victoria leaned back, studying her as if she were an interesting puzzle. A new girl, she mused. How bold of this place. Alyssa kept her tone level. Would you like to begin with a drink, Mrs. Harrington? Dean watched from across the dining room with dread. Becca watched with hands clasped tightly together. The entire staff had shifted their attention to the unfolding scene, each person waiting to see how the newest member of their team would fare against the restaurant's most feared customer. Alyssa didn't tremble. She didn't stumble. She didn't bow. Something in the room changed. Nobody knew it yet, but the woman standing at table 14 would be the reason everything at the Beaumont would soon turn upside down. Alyssa stood beside table 14 with the calmness of someone who had weathered storms far worse than demanding customers, though she could feel the energy around Victoria tightening like a coil preparing to snap. The other woman's eyes followed her movements with a mixture of curiosity and condescension, as if Alyssa were an exhibit to be examined rather than a real person. Alyssa had dealt with people like her before, individuals who believed service workers existed solely to absorb their frustrations. But there was something uniquely poisonous about Victoria's presence. She didn't just expect perfection, she expected obedience. And the moment Alyssa stepped into her line of fire, she sensed that this woman thrived on the discomfort she caused. Still, Alyssa refused to shrink. She squared her shoulders and steadied her breathing. She needed this job, but she needed her dignity too, and she had already decided which one she would cling to. Victoria crossed one leg over the other, diamonds glittering at her wrist as she tapped the table with her manicured nail. Let's start with something simple, she said, as if speaking to a trainee on their first day of kindergarten. Tell me you're at least competent with wine. Alyssa kept her expression neutral. I'd be happy to assist with any selection you'd like, am. Victoria smirked, clearly expecting a crack in her composure. Bring me the l'Ambroisie Chardonnay. If it's too warm or too cold or opened incorrectly, I'll send it back. Her tone suggested she planned to send it back regardless. Alyssa nodded. I'll bring it right out. When she turned to retrieve the bottle, she felt dozens of eyes flicking between her and Victoria. Some guests pretended to focus on their meals, but their posture told the truth. They were watching, anticipating. The Beaumont was no stranger to high-maintenance clients, but even the wealthiest patrons rarely generated a reaction like this. The staff watched too. The bartenders froze mid-pour. The hosts paused as they scanned the reservation list. And Becca pressed a napkin to the corner of her eye, as if trying to physically wipe away her panic. Alyssa's determination hardened. Whatever happened at that table, she wasn't going to crumble. In the wine alcove, Marco, the sommelier, already had the bottle waiting. He held it out with the delicate caution of someone handing over a live grenade. "Good luck," he whispered. "She once told me a cork looked at her funny." Alyssa cracked a grin despite the tension. "I will keep my eyes on it then." Marco chuckled nervously, but the worry returned a second later. "If she gives you trouble, call me." Alyssa knew he meant it. She returned to Victoria's table with smooth steps and steady breath, holding the wine bottle with practiced confidence. Victoria watched her approach like a predator evaluating the movements of its prey. "Show me the label," she demanded. Alyssa turned it toward her without hesitation. Victoria stared for several seconds, silently searching for an excuse to reject it. When she found none, she flicked her fingers. "Proceed." Alyssa cut the foil cleanly, inserted the corkscrew at a precise angle, and pulled the cork out with a soft, controlled pop. She poured a small tasting portion into the crystal glass. Victoria lifted it slowly, swirling it with the pompous flair of someone who enjoyed being observed. She took one sip and held it on her tongue longer than necessary. The entire restaurant seemed to lean forward, waiting. Finally, Victoria placed the glass down with a sharp click. "Acceptable," she said flatly. "Barely." Alyssa responded with a polite nod, neither shrinking nor reacting to the insult. "Would you like to order any appetizers while you look over the menu?" Victoria tilted her head. "Are you in a hurry, sweetheart?" Alyssa's jaw nearly tightened, but she caught it, keeping her voice even. "Just here to make sure you have everything you need." Victoria murmured, studying her as though trying to decide how best to break her spirit. "You speak differently from the others." Alyssa didn't respond, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. "They cower," Victoria continued. "You don't." Her lips curled into a thin smile, yet Alyssa felt the familiar pressure of someone trying to push her into the dirt, someone who needed the people around them smaller in order to feel bigger. She wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "Let me know when you're ready to order," she said simply, stepping back with poised control. She walked toward the service station, not quickly enough to appear intimidated, not slowly enough to appear confrontational. Balanced. Grounded. Dean met her halfway, anxiety written across his face. "How's she doing?" he asked, nodding toward Victoria. "Testing boundaries," Alyssa replied, "but manageable so far." Becca exhaled shakily beside them, visibly relieved. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to dump that table on you. Alyssa shook her head. "Becca, you don't owe anyone an apology." Ever. Becca's eyes glistened, and Dean placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Take 5, he said softly. "You've earned it." But Victoria wasn't content leaving Alyssa alone for long. Within minutes, she snapped her fingers sharply, the sound cutting through the restaurant like a crack of thunder. Alyssa returned to the table, posture steady. Victoria didn't wait for her to speak. "I'll have the lobster risotto," she announced. "But tell the chef not to drown it in saffron like last time. And make sure the grains aren't mushy. And bring it out at the proper temperature. You people always serve food too hot or too cold." Alyssa wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. "I'll inform the kitchen," she said. But Victoria wasn't finished. She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "And you, what's your name again?" "Alyssa, ma'am." "Alyssa," she repeated, as though testing the taste of it. "You seem new. Where did you work before this?" Alyssa kept her expression neutral. "Several places across Lime. "I wonder," Victoria said suddenly, her voice dropping into a darker tone. "Does your daughter know you were gone this late?" Alyssa's entire body went cold. "Excuse me." Victoria smiled, not kindly, but with the triumphant satisfaction of someone who had struck a nerve. "You think I don't know who works here? A single mother, 8-year-old girl. Lives in an apartment near Silver Lake." Alyssa's pulse thudded once hard. "You've done research on me." "I like knowing the people who serve me," Victoria said smoothly. "Makes it easier to understand their motivations." Something inside Alyssa shifted. A slow, steady heat spread through her chest, not anger, not panic, but a firm realization that this woman didn't just want control. She wanted dominance, and dominance required submission. Her submission. Alyssa straightened, her voice steady and clear. Mrs. Harrington, we will get your risotto out shortly. She walked away without breaking eye contact, refusing to give Victoria the reaction she wanted. Behind her, the entire staff watched, breaths tight, waiting to see what would happen now that Victoria had crossed a line most customers never dared approach. And though none of them knew it yet, that moment Alyssa walking away with her dignity intact was the first crack in the hold Victoria had over the Beaumont. A crack that would only widen from here. Alyssa moved toward the kitchen with the same measured stride she had used since the moment she stepped into the Beaumont, but her heart beat faster than she cared to admit. Victoria's words still echoed in her mind, her daughter, her neighborhood, her private life being dragged into a power game she never agreed to play. That wasn't simply entitlement, that was invasion. Yet even as the heat rose in her chest, Alyssa forced herself to stay focused. She handed the risotto ticket to Chef Adrian, who took one look at her expression and immediately understood something had shifted. She gave you trouble already? He asked while prepping the pan. Alyssa replied, she's fishing for a reaction. Adrian huffed. She always does. The kitchen moved like a well-oiled machine around them, but several cooks still shot glances her way, clearly curious whether she had already hit her breaking point. Alyssa didn't give them the satisfaction of an emotional collapse. There would be no trembling hands, no flustered apologies, no retreat. If Victoria expected her to crumble, she was in for a surprise. Back on the floor, Dean paced near table 14, pretending to rearrange menace and dust decorative fixtures while keeping watch. He was worried not about Alyssa's skill, but about Victoria's appetite for conflict. He had seen her destroy confident employees before. What he hadn't seen, not once in all his years managing the restaurant, was someone stand in front of her without shrinking. Alyssa did, and that unsettled him. He wanted to protect her, yet he couldn't intervene too early. Victoria would sense weakness and escalate. The staff hovered nearby, Becca wringing her hands at the service station, Marco adjusting wine bottles he had aligned 20 times already. Hosts pretending to check reservations while tracking every movement in the corner of their eyes. Alyssa emerged from the kitchen balancing a tray with water refills for another table. She didn't look toward Victoria, but the woman watched her every move. Alyssa could practically feel the cold attention on her neck. As she placed the glasses at table 6, the couple sitting there whispered, "Is that the same woman from the last scandalous Yelp review?" They glanced toward Victoria. Alyssa kept her expression blank, though she wasn't surprised. Wealthy clients left marks on restaurants, not just financial ones, but reputational ones too. By the time she returned to the service station, Becca pulled her aside with trembling urgency. "Alyssa, please be careful." Alyssa looked her in the eyes. "You've worked here for years. You shouldn't be this afraid." Becca shook her head. "You don't understand, she makes things personal. She digs into your life until she finds something to use against you." Alyssa's eyebrows tightened. "Why does everyone let her?" Becca swallowed hard. "Because her husband controls half the properties in this city. If Victoria complains, restaurants close. It's happened before." That reinforced everything Alyssa had already suspected, but it also fueled something inside her. Fear had ruled the Beaumont for too long. She wasn't about to let it rule her. The risotto came up from the kitchen, plated with meticulous precision, creamy texture, tender lobster chunks, a restrained touch of saffron, decorated with microgreens like jewels atop the dish. Chef Adrian handed it to her. "Serve it quickly and pray she's in a forgiving mood." Alyssa didn't pray. She prepared. Walking back to table 14 felt different this time. She carried the plate steadily, deliberately, her nerves held tightly in check. When she reached the table, Victoria gave her the kind of assessing look that made it clear she had been waiting for this moment. Once Alyssa set the dish down, Victoria leaned in and inspected it with slow, scrutinizing interest. She lifted a fork, tasted a single grain of rice, then set the utensil down with a dramatic sigh. "Of course," she said, voice dripping with contempt. "You people can't follow simple instructions." Alyssa met her gaze. "What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" Victoria pursed her lips, the saffron still heavy-handed. Alyssa knew the seasoning had been measured precisely. "I can have the kitchen adjust it, if you'd like another preparation." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "You think I want another preparation? The point is, it should have been right the first time." Alyssa stayed calm. "I understand." That response irritated Victoria even more. She wanted flustered apologies, panicked backtracking, anything that gave her leverage. Alyssa refused to give her that. "I'll take it back for you," she said. Victoria snapped, "I didn't say take it back." Alyssa paused. "Then how would you like me to assist?" Victoria tilted her head sharply. "I'd like you to recognize your mistakes." Alyssa stood straighter. "With respect, ma'am, I didn't cook the dish. But I'm here to make sure your experience is handled professionally." A flicker of annoyance, no outrage, crossed Victoria's face. No one talked to her that way. Not at restaurants, not at fundraisers, not anywhere. Alyssa's even tone wasn't defiant, but it wasn't submissive either. It landed with precise discomfort. Victoria pushed the plate aside with a dramatic scrape. "Take it away. And tell the chef this is unacceptable." Alyssa nodded, lifted the dish and turned to leave. As she walked toward the kitchen, guests at nearby tables exchanged looks. They could sense the tension rising. One even whispered, "She's trying to bait her." Alyssa knew that too, and she wasn't falling for it. Chef Adrian nearly dropped a pan when he saw Alyssa return with the risotto. "You were kidding, already?" Alyssa kept her voice low. She said the seasoning's off. Adrian muttered several words he'd never say in front of customers. "It's perfect," he growled. "Take a bite yourself." Alyssa did, and it was flawless, balanced, subtle, exactly as it should be. "She's not sending back the food," Alyssa said. "She's sending back control." Adrian exhaled in defeat. "Fine. I'll remake it." While waiting for the second dish, Alyssa stepped aside at the service station, feeling Victoria's stare even across the room. The woman was studying her with unrestrained irritation now, tapping her diamond ring against the table with rhythmic impatience. Every tap seemed to say, "I will break you. I always break them." Alyssa drew a deep breath. Let her tap. When the second risotto was ready, Alyssa carried it out. She placed it down carefully. Victoria tasted it once more. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Not a joyful sound, far from it. A cold, sharp laugh that drew attention from multiple tables. "So predictable," she said. "You think a new dish fixes anything?" Alyssa braced herself. Victoria leaned closer, voice soft but venomous. "I'm not interested in the food. I'm interested in you." Alyssa met her gaze evenly. That startled Victoria, who clearly expected fear. Alyssa said, "My job is to serve your meal, not entertain whatever game you're replaying." Victoria's smile vanished. "Do you know who I am?" Alyssa said. "A customer." Gasps rippled from tables within earshot. Victoria pushed her chair back sharply. "You're going to regret that," she hissed. "People like you always do." Alyssa didn't move. "People like me." Victoria smirked. "Single mothers, women who think they're strong until someone reminds them they're not." Alyssa's entire body tensed, but her voice didn't. "Enjoy your meal, Mrs. Harrington. Let me know if you need anything else." She walked away without breaking a step. Across the room, the staff watched with something new in their eyes, not fear, not pity, but awe. For the first time in the Beaumont's history, someone hadn't bowed to Victoria Harrington. And Victoria, for the first time, looked genuinely unsettled. This night was no longer following her script. The moment Alyssa walked away from table 14 without flinching, the atmosphere inside the Beaumont shifted in a way no one could fully explain. It was subtle at first, like the faint tremor that comes before a quake, an uneasy stir, a shift in posture, a quiet recognition among the staff that something unprecedented had occurred. Victoria Harrington, the woman who made seasoned professionals crumble with a single raised eyebrow, had just been met with a response she'd never encountered: calm, unwavering refusal to submit. Alyssa hadn't raised her voice, hadn't disrespected her, hadn't challenged her authority outright, or she simply didn't break. And for someone like Victoria, that was enough to ignite fury. Victoria lifted her wineglass, took a slow sip, and watched Alyssa across the room with a glare sharp enough to cut through glass. Her expression was dark and calculating, as though she were mapping out her next strategy. She didn't simply want the upper hand, she wanted the full theatrical submission she always extracted from staff, the proof that she held absolute control. Alyssa's composure had denied her that satisfaction, and denial was something Victoria had never learned to cope with. Dean noticed the change too. He stood near the bar pretending to check inventory, glancing repeatedly between Alyssa and Victoria. He'd seen Victoria angry before, but this was different. It was focused, intentional. She wasn't irritated by the food or the temperature or the candlelight. She was irritated by the woman who refused to become her entertainment. Dean clenched his jaw. He'd put Alyssa in this position because he had no choice but the decision weighed on him now. Each step Alyssa took across the dining room intensified his worry that Victoria was running through every possible way to retaliate. Alyssa carried a tray of appetizers to table 16, feeling the heavy weight of eyes on her, some curious, some concerned, some covertly impressed. She tried to keep her attention on the guests in front of her, but she could sense Victoria watching her without looking. The attention felt like walking through heat coming off asphalt. She remained steady as she delivered plates, refilled water, and checked in on tables. She hadn't realized how deeply the staff had been suffocating under the tyranny of one customer until she felt every gaze clinging to her, silently wishing they had her strength but terrified to follow her example. Meanwhile, Victoria continued her performance. She complained to the busser that the table beside her laughed too loudly. She scolded a server walking past for breathing too heavily near her booth. She flagged down Marco the sommelier just to inform him the wine was fine but not exceptional, despite the fact that she was the one who chose it. Every move she made was designed to cause disruption, to remind the room of her dominance. But the more chaos she tried to manufacture, the more attention drifted back to Alyssa, who refused to be rattled. And that aggravated Victoria most of all. Becca watched from the service station with her heart pinched in her chest. She felt guilt, fear, admiration, and dread all tumbling together. Alyssa had taken the blow meant for her, and part of her wanted to run and apologize again, to beg Alyssa to stop provoking Victoria with her unwavering strength, though Alyssa wasn't provoking anything. She was simply existing without bending. But Becca had learned that to someone like Victoria, even neutrality felt like defiance. She whispered, "Dean, we have to do something." Dean shook his head. "If we step in too early, she'll take it as an attack. Alyssa knows what she's doing." But the worry in his voice betrayed him. The second risotto came up again untouched except for the bite Victoria used to justify her disdain. As Alyssa took a moment to breathe near the station, Marco approached with a glass of ice water. "You need this," he said softly. Alyssa accepted it, offering a grateful nod. "Is she always like this?" she asked. Marco exhaled through his nose. "This is her in a good mood." Alyssa took a slow sip, feeling her resolve settle once more. She wasn't here to fight, she was here to work. But she refused to be demeaned for doing her job. Then Victoria made her move. She snapped her fingers, not the quick, impatient kind she'd used earlier, but a slow, deliberate snap meant to summon Alyssa the way someone might call a dog. A few guests turned their heads. Snapping at staff was frowned upon even by the most entitled elites. But Victoria didn't care. She snapped again, louder. Alyssa handed the water glass back to Marco and walked toward the table with steady steps. Victoria didn't wait for her to arrive. Finally, she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten who you were serving." Alyssa folded her hands neatly. "How can I help you, Mrs. Harrington?" Victoria gestured at the risotto. "Eat it." Alyssa paused. "I'm sorry." Victoria smiled, a shark-like smile. "If you were so confident this dish is perfect, why don't you eat a bite for me right now?" Gasps erupted from two nearby tables. That was crossing a line not just of etiquette but of human decency. Alyssa stayed composed. "Restaurant policy doesn't allow staff to eat guests' meals." "Policy?" Victoria laughed mockingly. "You want to talk about policy? You can't hide behind rules, sweetheart. You work for me. Everything in this place works for me. Now take a bite." Alyssa's heartbeat pounded, but her expression didn't shift. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm here to serve your meal, not to perform at your command." Victoria's eyes flared. She leaned forward, voice venomous. "Do it, or I'll tell your manager that you refused a direct request and disrespected a paying client." Alyssa glanced at Dean, who had gone pale and motionless. If she refused, Victoria would escalate. If she complied, she would surrender everything she had held firm on. Victoria waited, savoring the power she thought she had restored. But Alyssa stood fully upright. "I won't be eating your meal," she said calmly. "If there's an issue with the dish, I'll replace it. Otherwise, I'll continue serving other tables." She turned slightly to leave. Victoria slammed her hand on the table so loudly that silverware rattled and several diners flinched. "Don't you dare walk away from me," she barked. "I'm not finished with you." Alyssa stopped. The entire restaurant's attention fell onto the confrontation. Victoria took a slow breath, then said with a razor edge, "You really don't understand your place, do you? Women like you should be grateful anyone is willing to hire you." Do you think the Beaumont can afford the liability of a single mother who was fired from her last job for assaulting a customer? Alyssa froze. Not with fear. With realization. Victoria had dug deeper. Far deeper. Whispers rippled across the dining room. Dean stared at Alyssa, horrified. Becca covered her mouth. Marco blinked as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Alyssa slowly turned back to face Victoria. Their eyes locked. Victoria expected tears, panic, desperation, something she could feed on. Instead, Alyssa stayed utterly composed. Mrs. Harrington, she said softly, firmly, your meal is ready when you choose to eat it. I'll return shortly to refill your glass. She walked away, back straight, pace steady, dignity intact. Every head followed her. Victoria stared after her, stunned. She had expected a collapse. She had expected victory. Instead, she had met a wall she couldn't knock down. And in that moment, for the first time in the Beaumont's history, the staff realized the unthinkable. Victoria Harrington had finally encountered someone she couldn't break. Alyssa's steps carried her back toward the service station with a composure that felt almost unreal, as if she were performing a role she hadn't rehearsed but somehow knew instinctively. The murmurs spreading through the dining room made it clear that guests were fully aware something extraordinary had just unfolded. Yet Alyssa refused to let her breathing falter or her expression shift. She had worked too hard in life to allow one wealthy woman's venom to define her. Even so, the weight of what Victoria had revealed, her past, her daughter, the job she lost, hung behind Alyssa like a shadow. But instead of slowing her down, it sharpened her resolve. She would not let her history become ammunition in someone else's cruelty. Becca was the first to reach her. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I'm so sorry she said that to you. She had no right. Alyssa placed a hand gently on her arm. You didn't cause this, Becca, she murmured. She just wants control. And I'm not giving it to her. Becca swallowed hard. But she's dangerous. You have to understand that. Alyssa's expression stayed level. I understand exactly what she is. Behind them, Dean approached, trying to maintain professional posture even as tension flooded his face. Alyssa, he said quietly, you handled that better than anyone I've seen. But this is escalating. If you need me to step in, Alyssa shook her head before he could finish. If you step in, she'll treat it as validation that she won. Let me finish what I started. Dean exhaled slowly, torn between admiration and fear. Every part of him wanted to shield her, yet he also recognized that she hadn't stumbled once, not even when Victoria weaponized her past. Most staff would have dissolved under that kind of attack. Alyssa didn't even flinch. Just be careful, he said at last. She's unpredictable. Alyssa nodded. I know, but I'm not here to lose. Across the room, Marco watched the exchange, shaking his head in disbelief. He leaned over the bar, muttering to the bartender, did you see that? She didn't even blink. The bartender replied, I've worked here 6 years. I've never seen anyone stand up to that woman like this. Even the guests noticed. A man at table 7 whispered to his companion, that server has more backbone than half this city. His companion nodded. Honestly, I'm rooting for her. Meanwhile, Victoria sat rigidly at table 14, gripping her wineglass as if it might shatter under the pressure of her anger. Her cheeks were flushed with the frustration of someone unaccustomed to losing ground, and the muscles in her jaw twitched with every breath. She replayed the interaction in her mind, each moment tightening the knot in her chest. Alyssa's refusal to obey her commands had struck deeper than any insult. It wasn't defiance in the traditional sense. Alyssa hadn't yelled, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't been rude. She had done something far worse. In Victoria's eyes, she had refused to fear her. Victoria's gaze stayed locked on Alyssa like a laser, tracking every movement she made. Her thoughts spiraled with indignation. How dare she? How dare this nobody, this underpaid single mother, stand there like she was untouchable? Victoria couldn't recall the last time someone denied her power. Even at charity galas, even in private meetings, even with her husband's business associates, she had always commanded respect or at least compliance. But Alyssa had cracked her illusion, and that, more than anything, infuriated her. Her fingers tapped against the stem of her wineglass with growing intensity. She wasn't finished. She would not leave the restaurant feeling defeated. She needed to regain control, to crush the spark she saw in Alyssa before it spread. Because that spark was dangerous. It was contagious. It made the staff stand straighter. It made guests watch with interest rather than fear. If she didn't extinguish it, the Beaumont might never return to the predictable submission she enjoyed. Alyssa stepped away from the service station to check on her remaining tables. At table 10, she refilled water glasses with steady hands, offering warm, professional smiles. The couple there leaned in as she set down the pitcher. "Are you all right?" the woman whispered. Alyssa offered a small nod. "I'm okay, ma'am. Thank you." The woman squeezed her hand gently. "You handled that beautifully. Don't let her get to you." Alyssa gave a grateful smile and continued making her rounds. But the more she remained composed, the angrier Victoria became. The emerald-dressed woman straightened abruptly and raised her hand. "Alyssa," she called across the room, her voice slicing through the air like a command. Several guests turned in irritation at the rudeness of yelling for staff, but Victoria didn't care. She wanted a performance. Alyssa inhaled slowly, then walked back to table 14. "Yes, Mrs. Harrington." Victoria's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "I'd like a refill." Alyssa glanced at the glass. It was nearly full. "Of course," she said calmly. She reached for the wine bottle. Victoria jerked her hand back. "Not from that one. That bottle has been contaminated." Alyssa kept her tone professional. "I assure you, ma'am, the bottle hasn't been touched." Victoria lifted her chin sharply. "Bring me a new one. And this time, make sure Marco doesn't select a cheap vintage." Across the dining room, Marco gritted his teeth. Cheap. That bottle alone cost more than most people's weekly rent. But Victoria wasn't commenting on quality. She was attacking Alyssa indirectly. She wanted Alyssa flustered, rushing between stations, desperate to please her. Alyssa simply responded, "I'll bring a fresh bottle immediately." Victoria expected irritation. She received professionalism. She expected a crack. She received control. She expected exhaustion. She received strength. And that only deepened her rage. Alyssa returned with the new bottle, presenting it with the same steady hands and level voice. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically as though the very sight of Alyssa offended her. "Open it," she snapped. Alyssa obliged. Her movements were smooth, precise, annoyingly perfect to Victoria's obsessive gaze. When Alyssa poured the tasting portion, Victoria swirled it with exaggerated scrutiny. She took one sip, paused, then said, "Barely acceptable. Pour." Alyssa filled the glass to the proper level and stepped back. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You really think you can win, don't you?" Alyssa met her gaze with calm eyes. "I'm not trying to win anything, ma'am. I'm just doing my job." Victoria laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Your job is to obey, not to stand there pretending you're equal to me." Alyssa responded with a measured breath. "My job is to serve your meal with professionalism. Nothing more, nothing less." Victoria's face reddened. "You think you're clever." Alyssa replied, "I think I'm focused on my work." The simplicity of the words infuriated Victoria. She snapped, "Get me the manager, now." Dean stiffened from across the room. Alyssa didn't move. "If you'd like to speak with him, I'll let him know." Victoria's smile turned cold. "Don't worry. I'll make sure he understands exactly what kind of employee he's hired." As Alyssa walked away to notify Dean, the staff didn't just watch, they stood a little taller. Something powerful was happening. Something none of them had dared imagine. For the first time in years, Victoria Harrington wasn't the force shaping the room. Alyssa was. And everyone knew the night was only going to get more volatile from here. Dean approached table 14 with the caution of someone walking across thin ice. Every step measured, every breath held just enough to stay steady. He had no idea what Victoria would accuse Alyssa of, but he knew whatever came out of her mouth would be exaggerated, twisted, or entirely fabricated. Victoria leaned back in her chair as he approached, swirling her wine with the smug composure of a queen waiting for her advisor to kneel. "Finally," she said, as if granting him the privilege of her grievance, "your employee has crossed a line." Dean forced a neutral smile. "How can I assist you tonight, Mrs. Harrington?" Victoria set her glass down with a soft click that seemed far louder than it was. "Alyssa has disrespected me repeatedly. She refuses to follow simple requests. She speaks to me as if we were equals, and she has an attitude completely inappropriate for staff in an establishment like this." Dean's throat tightened. He kept his voice calm. "I'm sorry to hear that. I can assure you our staff is trained to be professional." "Professional?" Victoria scoffed. "She's defiant, insolent, and frankly, she shouldn't be working here." Dean's heart sank, but he didn't let it show. "If you'd like, I can have another server take over your table." Victoria's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Oh, I'm long past that. I don't want her replaced. I want her held accountable. Dean inhaled slowly. What are you requesting exactly? Victoria leaned forward, hands clasped atop the table, her expression sharpening into something predatory. I want her to come back here and apologize. Properly, head down, acknowledging that she overstepped. Several guests at nearby tables shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Even for those who didn't know Victoria's reputation, the request itself felt archaic, like something ripped from a world where hierarchy mattered more than humanity. Dean struggled to find words. Mrs. Harrington, that's not our standard protocol. Victoria's nostrils flared. I don't care about your protocol. I care about respect. Alyssa watched from the edge of the dining room, her expression unreadable. She couldn't hear every word, but she didn't need to. She knew what Victoria wanted. She always wanted the same thing, a public reminder that she held the power and everyone else bowed to it. Dean continued trying to negotiate. Mrs. Harrington, Alyssa has handled your service professionally all evening. If there was a miscommunication, Victoria cut him off sharply. Stop defending her. I don't want explanations. I want her to understand that when she speaks to me, she does so from her position, not mine. Her voice carried across the room, drawing eyes even from guests trying not to stare. And until she acknowledges that, I will consider this an intentional insult. Dean looked at her closely, searching for any signs she might be bluffing, but her expression was carved from pure determination. He understood now this wasn't about food service or policy. This was personal. Victoria wanted to break Alyssa because Alyssa hadn't broken on her own. Dean straightened. I will speak with her. Victoria leaned back, victorious. You do that. As he walked away, the room held a palpable tension, not the frozen kind, but a restless, electric pressure that made people sit up straighter. Alyssa waited in the hallway near the kitchen entrance, hands clasped behind her apron. When Dean reached her, he rubbed a hand over his forehead. Alyssa, she wants an apology. Alyssa's gaze didn't waver. I figured a public apology, he added. Head down. Admitting you were out of line. Alyssa's jaw tightened subtly. Was I? Dean exhaled heavily. No. But she doesn't care about what happened. She cares about the performance. Alyssa looked past him toward table 14. I'm not doing that. I won't bow to her. Dean nodded slowly, almost with relief despite the risk. I didn't think you would. But I had to tell you. Across the room, Victoria watched their interaction with the anticipation of a lion waiting for prey to fall into the trap. She expected Alyssa to crumble. She expected Dean to drag Alyssa back to her table in subservience. She expected victory because she always got it. Alyssa walked toward her, each step steady, purposeful, unhurried. Guests held their breath. Even the clatter in the kitchen softened as the tension reached its peak. Alyssa stopped at the edge of the table. Mrs. Harrington, she said, voice controlled and respectful, my manager tells me you requesting an apology. Victoria sat upright, smile wide. Correct, and I expect it now. Alyssa nodded once. I won't be giving you that. Victoria blinked, the smile evaporating. Excuse me. Alyssa's tone remained level. I've treated you with professionalism. I've addressed every concern you raised. I haven't raised my voice, shown attitude, or refused service. I'm not apologizing for treating you with respect while maintaining my own. Victoria's breathing hitched in indignation. You think you can talk to me like that? After everything, Alyssa let her hands fall gently at her sides. Mrs. Harrington, I understand you upset. But I will not participate in whatever game you trying to play. A murmur rolled through the dining room, subtle but undeniable. People exchanged looks, impressed or stunned or both. Victoria felt the shift instantly, eyes drifting toward them. Attention she didn't control, narrative she didn't shape. And that terrified her far more than anything Alyssa had said. Her fingers curled around her wineglass. You embarrassing yourself, she hissed. Actually, Alyssa replied, I think I'm finally showing what everyone else here deserves, to be treated like humans, not props. A few guests straightened in their seats. Someone whispered, good for her. Victoria heard it, her face twisted. You redone, she spat. Fired. Tonight I will make sure of it. Your manager will have no choice. Your daughter will suffer for your pride. Alyssa's breath caught, but she didn't break. She met Victoria's eyes with a steady, anchored gaze. Threaten me if you want, she said. But leave my daughter out of your mouth. For the first time all night, Victoria faltered. Not because of fear, but because Alyssa wasn't following the script. She wasn't crying, pleading, lowering her gaze. She was standing tall. Victoria recovered quickly and barked, Dean. Get over here! Dean approached reluctantly. Mrs. Harrington, Victoria pointed at Alyssa with trembling rage. I want her fired. Right now. Dean swallowed, the pressure almost crushing. The entire restaurant watched. The staff stood frozen. Even the kitchen doors had paused mid-motion. Alyssa put a hand gently on Dean's arm. It's fine, she said softly. I'll leave no. The voice came from behind them. Strong, male. Commanding. The dining room turned. Richard Harrington, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, stood in the entrance of the Beaumont. Victoria froze, her confidence began to fracture. And for the first time all night, she wasn't the most powerful person in the room. Richard Harrington didn't rush when he entered the Beaumont. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the room. People who hadn't even noticed the confrontation at table 14 now glanced toward the doorway with recognition. Richard was not the kind of man one easily overlooked. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the quiet force of someone accustomed to commanding not just a room but entire industries. He scanned the dining space only once before his eyes landed on Victoria, who had risen halfway from her chair, caught between outrage and panic. If she had been holding a weapon, she would have dropped it. Richard, she stammered, smoothing her dress as if he'd caught her somewhere she shouldn't be. I didn't expect you tonight. He stepped forward with calm steps, not angry, not hurried, just intentional, clearly. Dean straightened to full height, torn between relief and dread. The staff watched as though witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime event. Even the guests sensed the change. Conversation slowed, forks paused mid-air, and heads tilted subtly as the tension rolled across the room. Richard arrived at the table and looked between Victoria and Alyssa, who stood a respectful distance back, refusing to shrink even as the stakes escalated around her. Richard addressed his wife first. I heard you made quite an entrance. Victoria forced a laugh too sharp to sound natural. These people don't know how to treat paying customers. This girl, she pointed at Alyssa with a flick of her wrist, has been disrespectful to me all night. I asked her to apologize, and she refused. Richard didn't look at Alyssa yet. He kept his gaze on Victoria. What did she do? Victoria blinked. I just told you she was rude. Specifically, Richard said with a controlled patience that unsettled the entire room. What did she do? Victoria hesitated. She questioned me. She refused my requests. She challenged my authority. Richard's expression remained unchanged. Requests such as, Victoria's throat bobbed in irritation. She wouldn't eat the dish I asked her to taste. She wouldn't apologize. She talked back. Richard exhaled once through his nose, a subtle release of restrained frustration. So nothing that endangered you. Nothing inappropriate. She simply said no. Victoria's jaw tightened. Richard, whose side are you on? Alyssa lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but to steady her breath. She didn't want to escalate things, but she also wouldn't erase what happened. Richard finally turned toward her. You re Alyssa? She nodded. Yes, sir. Are you the one who's been serving my wife tonight? Yes. Did you raise your voice? No. Use profanity? No. Refuse service? No, sir. Her answers were calm, clipped, professional. Everything Victoria's performance wasn't. Richard studied her for a moment, noting the steadiness in her posture, the fatigue around her eyes, and the faint tremor she worked hard to suppress. Did my wife threaten your employment? Yes, Alyssa replied. More than once. Richard's jaw clenched, not dramatically. Just enough for those paying attention to see the shift. He'd been in enough boardrooms to recognize when someone abused power simply because they could. Victoria scoffed loudly. So you just going to take her word for it? I'm taking the room's word for it, Richard said as he gestured toward the tables around them. Because in that exact moment, several guests averted their eyes too quickly. A couple at a nearby booth dropped their silverware. A young server sucked in a breath. Their reactions weren't subtle. Everyone knew what had been happening. Richard turned back to Victoria with a level stare that held years of unspoken arguments. You've done this before. Excuse me, she said, voice rising. You've done this in hotel lobbies, at charity events, at my partner's restaurants. And always, it's the same story. You re the victim, and everyone else is beneath you. Victoria's face flushed an angry red. I don't appreciate being talked to like this in public. Then stop giving me reasons to. Alyssa instinctively stepped back, sensing this was no longer about her, not fully. This was a marriage tearing at its seams, exposed under the glow of chandeliers and the gaze of strangers. But she stood her ground, refusing to disappear simply because the confrontation wasn't convenient anymore. Victoria's voice sharpened. I asked for one thing, one apology, and she couldn't even give me that. Because she didn't owe you one, Richard said. His tone wasn't loud, but it struck harder than shouting. Victoria staggered, caught completely off guard. How can you say that? Because I've listened to you tear people down for years. And I've let you, he admitted, the weight of it pressing into his words. That's on me. But this, he gestured toward Alyssa. This ends tonight. The dining room erupted in subtle reactions: shock, disbelief, even quiet satisfaction. Victoria's composure fell apart entirely. You re-humiliating me, she snapped. No, Richard said. You did that to yourself. She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand, not aggressively, but firmly enough to stop her. Don't. Not tonight. Not about this. He looked around the room, taking in the staff whose livelihoods depended on balancing professionalism with fear. These people work hard. They do their best. They don't deserve to be treated like obstacles. Then his gaze returned to Alyssa. And they definitely don't deserve threats. Alyssa's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Becca wiped tears from her eyes at the service station. Marco leaned against the bar as if physically supporting himself through the moment. Dean's shoulders loosened for the first time in an hour. Victoria's expression fractured into something raw. You re-siding with them over your own wife. I'm siding with the truth, Richard said, and with decency. Victoria stepped back, her voice trembling finally, for a reason other than rage. I can't believe this. Believe it, Richard replied. Because I'm done pretending this is normal. For the first time all night, Victoria didn't respond. She stood frozen, chest rising and falling rapidly, eyes darting around as if searching for anyone who might side with her. But the room wasn't on her side anymore. It never truly had been. Alyssa felt her breath return to her body as Richard faced her one more time. No one is losing their job tonight, he said firmly. In fact, consider yourself under my personal protection in this establishment. Victoria flinched. Alyssa nodded slowly, respectfully. Thank you, sir. Richard turned back to his wife. Victoria, it's time to go. She stared at him in disbelief. Now. Yes, now. And in a moment that would be retold by staff for years, Richard Harrington escorted his stunned, furious wife out of the Beaumont, leaving behind a dining room filled with people who had just witnessed the unmasking of a tyrant. Alyssa stood rooted to the spot, chest lifting in a slow, controlled breath. She had not only survived Victoria Harrington, she had forced the entire building to confront what they had enabled for far too long. And the night wasn't even over yet. The moment the front doors closed behind Richard and Victoria, the air inside the Beaumont shifted with an intensity no one knew how to process. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was the collective exhale of people who had been holding themselves together for far too long. Servers looked at one another with wide eyes. Busboys paused mid-step. A bartender leaned back against the counter with a shaky laugh. And even Chef Adrian poked his head out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron as if he had just missed the final act of a play he'd waited years to see. But at the center of it all was Alyssa, still standing where she had been when Richard intervened. Her posture remained steady, her expression composed, yet the weight of everything that had just occurred pressed against her chest in waves: shock, adrenaline, exhaustion, and something else she hadn't felt in a long time, the sense that she hadn't been alone. Dean approached her first. His voice was softer than it had been all night. Alyssa, are you all right? She nodded once, though her throat felt tight. I'm okay. Dean exhaled in what was half a laugh, half a release of nerves. You handled that better than anyone could be asked for. He glanced around the room, lowering his voice. Better than I ever have. The admission surprised her. You deal with people like her all the time. Not like that, he replied. Not with everyone watching. Not with her husband contradicting every lie she tried to spin. You didn't just stand your ground, you changed the atmosphere of this place. Before Alyssa could respond, Becca practically flung herself forward, her hands trembling not from fear this time, but from the emotional overload of witnessing something she had never thought possible. Alyssa, she whispered, her voice cracking, you saved us tonight. Alyssa blinked in confusion. Saved you? All of us, Becca insisted. You don't understand. She's been doing this for years. Years. Becca's breath shuddered. People quit. People cried. Some lost jobs because they snapped under the pressure. And we all just kept trying to survive it. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears. But you made her stop. Marco walked over, shaking his head with a stunned grin. I kept waiting for you to break. Everyone breaks with her. He paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. But you didn't even bend. Alyssa offered a small smile. I just did what felt right. What felt right, Marco repeated, almost amused. Do you realize what you've done? You shattered her routine. You cracked the power she held over this place. Look at them. He gestured around the restaurant. Staff stood taller, voices steadier, steps more confident. They weren't whispering anxiously or avoiding eye contact, they were talking. Openly. About her. About Victoria. About what they had all endured. A busser, barely 18, stepped forward. He'd only been working for 2 weeks, but the fear of Victoria had already left marks on him. I thought she was going to get you fired, he said, voice wavering. I thought she was going to get all of us fired. Alyssa crouched slightly to meet his eye level. She didn't, because you didn't back down, he said. I want to be like that someday. His words hit her unexpectedly hard. Alyssa steadied herself, placing a hand on his arm. You will be. Just don't let people like her decide who you are. More staff gathered, hosts, bussers, servers, even 2 line cooks who had slipped out of the kitchen pretending to check table flow. They formed a loose circle around Alyssa, not to overwhelm her, but because they didn't know how else to express what her actions had meant to them. They had been working under a shadow for so long that watching someone stand fully in the light felt like witnessing a shift in gravity. A young hostess spoke next. Whenever she came in, we felt trapped, like we had to pass her tests just to keep our jobs. She paused. But you didn't play. A dishwasher near the back nodded fervently. You treated her like a customer, not like an owner. Not like a queen, Becca added. Not like a monster, someone else murmured. Alyssa shook her head gently. I didn't do anything special. That sparked an immediate, collective protest. Yes, you did, Marco argued. You told her no. Nobody tells her no. You were calm, Becca added. You were strong. You didn't look away, said a bartender. You didn't let her use your past against you, whispered the hostess. You didn't let her win, the busser said quietly. Dean raised his hand, silencing the growing chorus. Let's be clear, he said, his voice carrying across the group. Tonight wasn't just about Alyssa versus Victoria. Tonight was years of fear finally hitting a wall. He looked at Alyssa, sincerity etching lines across his face. And you were that wall. Alyssa inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of their words rooting somewhere deep within her. She had walked into this job needing a paycheck, needing stability for her daughter. She hadn't expected to be anyone's symbol of courage. She hadn't expected to change an entire workplace culture in one night. And yet, looking around at their faces filled with gratitude, awe, and relief, she realized that strength sometimes shows up in the exact moment someone refuses to let cruelty pass unchecked. The staff began to disperse slowly, returning to their tables, their duties, their guests, but with renewed energy. Even the diners felt it. Conversations softened, but in a reflective way, as if they sensed they had witnessed something powerful. A couple raised their glasses in Alyssa's direction discreetly. A woman at table 10 placed her hand over her heart when Alyssa walked past. A man at table 7 murmured, "Good for her," as she refilled his glass. It wasn't applause. It wasn't loud acknowledgement. It was respect. Genuine respect, the kind Victoria had always demanded but never earned. Back at the service station, Alyssa took a long drink of water, finally letting her shoulders relax. Dean stood beside her, crossing his arms with a grin that tugged at one corner of his mouth. "I was going to check if you needed to go home early," he said. "But honestly," he glanced at her with a kind of admiration she wasn't used to receiving, "I think you reholding this place together better than all of us combined." Alyssa laughed weakly, rubbing her forehead. "I'm just tired." "You deserve to be," Dean said. "But you also deserve to know something." He looked directly at her. "None of us will forget what you did tonight." Alyssa swallowed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," Dean said. "You set us free." Across the restaurant, the staff continued to work faster, lighter, less afraid. The haunting anticipation that once accompanied Victoria's visits had evaporated, replaced by something fragile but unmistakable: unity. It wasn't loud or formal or even spoken outright. It showed in the way coworkers exchanged nods, in how they helped each other more readily, in the subtle but powerful realization shared by everyone. If one person could stand up to a tyrant, then maybe, someday, all of them could. For the first time in years, the Beaumont didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a team. And Alyssa Parker, A woman who had taken her first shift only hours earlier had become the anchor that held them steady. Even after Richard escorted Victoria out of the Beaumont, the shockwaves of her breakdown rippled through the dining room like aftershocks from an earthquake. Alyssa could still feel the tension humming beneath the polished decor, the faint tremor in the hands of her coworkers, the way customers glanced around as though expecting Victoria to burst back through the doors at any moment. But she was gone, really gone, and the energy in the restaurant shifted again, this time into something bold and electric. It wasn't relief. It was awakening. The staff, still stunned by the confrontation, began to grasp what Richard's intervention truly meant. He had not only shut Victoria down, he had stripped away the fear she held over them. Becca was the first to step forward from the service station. Her face carried a mix of determination and exhaustion, but for the first time in years, not fear. "I'm done," she murmured to Marco, though the words came out louder than she intended. "If she ever comes back here, I'm not serving her again. I won't do it." Marco nodded fiercely. "None of us will." Another server, James, stepped forward. "She walked all over me last time she was here. I kept pretending I didn't care, but it ruined my whole week. If she walks in again, I'm standing with Alyssa." A dishwasher wiping down glasses looked up. "She threatened to get me fired because I dropped a spoon near her table." A hostess chimed in. "She told me I wasn't pretty enough to greet her. I cried in the bathroom." A busser added, "She once threw a napkin at me over a crease. It was as though a dam had burst." For the first time, the staff weren't bottling their trauma. They were confessing it to each other, to themselves, to the room. And they weren't hiding behind hushed tones or pretending to be unfazed. They were finally admitting they had suffered. But Alyssa noticed something even more extraordinary. Customers were listening. Not just listening, but reacting. A woman at table 10 pushed her chair back and stood. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice clear enough to carry. "You shouldn't have to deal with that. No one should." A man in a suit at table 7 raised his wine glass toward Alyssa. "That was the bravest thing I've seen in a restaurant. Ever." The couple at table 6, who'd been quietly checking on Alyssa earlier, now turned to Dean. "If management doesn't protect your staff when she returns, we'll stop dining here." A family near the window joined in, "And so will we." One by one, endorsements filled the room, not applause, not cheers, just firm declarations from paying customers who had witnessed more than enough. Dean raised his hands gently, as if steadying a boat caught in a rising tide. "Everyone, thank you," he said, trying to maintain professionalism. "We appreciate the support." But the customers weren't finished. The woman from table 10 gestured around her. "Your staff deserves safety. We come here for the service, the food, the experience, not to watch employees get harassed." A man just behind her added, "And not to dine next to someone who treats people like garbage." Laughter rippled across the dining room, not mocking laughter, but that cathartic kind that comes when the truth finally surfaces. Alyssa felt her chest tighten with emotion as she glanced around at the growing circle of support. The staff who had once avoided eye contact with Victoria were now looking directly at each other, standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time. The customers were no longer passive observers, they were advocates. And for the first time since she started her shift, Alyssa felt something powerful settle over the room: unity. Dean cleared his throat, looking overwhelmed but proud. "I think," he began slowly, "we need to address something as a team." He gestured for the staff to gather near the bar, and they moved as a collective group, something that had never happened during a shift. Alyssa joined them. Marco crossed his arms, jaw set firmly. Becca wiped her face and clasped Alyssa's hand in hers. James stepped close enough to form a protective wall. Even the line cooks, still wearing aprons stained with the night's work, left the kitchen to stand with their co-workers. Dean took a breath. Tonight proved something: we don't have to accept abuse. Not from anyone. Not even someone as powerful as Victoria Harrington. Several employees nodded fiercely. Becca squeezed Alyssa's hand harder. "We've let her treat us like garbage for years," she said. "But we don't have to anymore." Marco added, "If she ever walks through those doors again, we're not serving her." A murmur of agreement swept through the staff. The dishwasher raised his fist slightly. "She's not welcome here." A hostess echoed, "We refuse her." It wasn't a chant. It wasn't loud. It was conviction, collective, unbroken. Dean looked at Alyssa. "What do you think?" All eyes turned to her. She felt the weight of their hope and their newfound boldness leaning in her direction. Alyssa swallowed, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "I think no one deserves to be treated the way she treated us," she said. "I think we have the right to say no." Her eyes swept across the staff, then the customers. "And I think we deserve better." The reaction wasn't applause, it was stronger. Heads nodded, eyes sharpened, spines straightened. Someone whispered, "Absolutely." Someone else murmured, "We were done being scared." Then something completely unexpected happened. A couple at table 3 stood. Then another table rose, and another. Within moments, nearly half the restaurant was standing, not shouting, not clapping, just rising in a quiet show of support that carried more force than any protest could. It was a visual declaration: "We re with you. We see what you endured. We won't tolerate it either." Alyssa felt her breath catch in her throat. Not from fear, from validation. From the realization that she hadn't just defended herself, she had awakened an entire room. Dean, visibly moved, wiped a hand across his face. "Thank you," he said to the guests. "You don't know how much this means." Marco added, "This changes everything." Becca nodded through fresh tears. "Tonight she didn't break us." Alyssa responded softly, "Tonight we broke her cycle." And everyone knew it was true. The Beaumont wasn't the same restaurant it had been an hour earlier. The fear that once hovered like a permanent fixture had evaporated. In its place stood a collective resolve, a team finally united, supported by customers who believed in justice, and anchored by a single new hire who, without meaning to, had led them all into a new era. For the first time in years, the staff of the Beaumont weren't victims of Victoria Harrington. They were a family, and they had chosen strength together. Richard hadn't even cleared the parking lot before he turned around and re-entered the Beaumont. The staff could tell immediately his energy wasn't tense or explosive like Victoria's had been. It was grounded, focused, controlled in a way that made people straighten without realizing. When he walked through the doorway, the dining room fell into a subtle stillness, not fear but anticipation. He scanned the room briefly before his eyes found Alyssa again. This time, his expression wasn't stern. It was thoughtful, determined, and beneath that, something like regret. Dean stepped forward instinctively, as though preparing to manage another crisis. "Mut Harrington," he said carefully, "is everything." Richard shook his head, cutting him off with a gentle gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm here because there are things that need to be addressed." He directed his attention toward the staff who had gathered loosely near the bar, their postures alert, but no longer afraid. "Everyone," he continued, "I owe you more than an apology." Alyssa swallowed hard, unsure where this was going. The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. Guests leaned subtly in their chairs, listening without making it obvious. Richard drew a breath, steadying his voice. "For years, my wife has behaved in ways that harmed people. Not just in this restaurant, but in places all over this city." He let the weight of his words settle. "And I let it happen." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. No one expected him to say something like that, not in public, not with strangers listening, not with employees he barely knew. But Richard continued. "I justified it. I said she was under stress or misunderstood or reacting to pressures no one could see. I made excuses. And my excuses let her continue hurting people who were simply doing their jobs." He glanced at Becca, who stiffened as though unprepared for the acknowledgement. He looked at Marco, then the bussers, the hostesses, the cooks. "I failed you," he admitted, voice low but unwavering. "All of you." Alyssa felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, just the unfamiliar sensation of witnessing a powerful man take responsibility instead of deflecting it. Dean cleared his throat, obviously shaken. "Mr. Harrington, we appreciate you saying that." Richard nodded once. "But words aren't enough. Not tonight. Not after what happened here." He turned fully toward Alyssa. Her breath caught. "You," he said, "showed more integrity, composure, and courage in one evening than some people show in their entire lives." Alyssa felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her posture steady. "I was just doing my job," she said softly. Richard shook his head. "No. You were protecting yourself in a situation where most people would." V collapsed. "You stood up for every person in this room without raising your voice, without being disrespectful, without losing your professionalism. That takes strength." Marco murmured, "Told you," under his breath, prompting a small ripple of quiet laughter among the staff. Richard continued, his voice firming. "So here's what's going to happen." He looked at Dean. First, absolutely no one in this restaurant will face consequences for what happened tonight. Not warnings, not notes in personnel files, nothing. Anyone who stood up, anyone who spoke up, anyone who supported each other, consider yourselves protected. Dean nodded quickly. Understood. Second, Richard added, lifting his chin slightly, Victoria is no longer permitted to dine here. Gasps sounded from two nearby tables. The staff froze. Even Alyssa stared at him, stunned. Banning a high-profile millionaire's wife from an iconic Los Angeles restaurant was something no one would have dared imagine. I'll speak with the owners personally, Richard went on. But I'll make this clear now, she will not step foot in this establishment again. Becca pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. The young busser whispered, holy crap. It was a seismic shift, an unthinkable one. Victoria Harrington had been a terrorizing force for years, and now she was barred because someone finally stood firm. Third, Richard said, I'm compensating the staff for what you endured tonight. Dean lifted a brow. Sir, that's not necessary. It is, Richard insisted. Consider it recognition for your professionalism under pressure that no employee should ever face. He looked at Alyssa again. Especially you. Alyssa blinked, startled. Me? Yes, Richard's voice softened, but only slightly. I'm offering you a full-time permanent position here. Benefits, pay raise, schedule flexibility, whatever makes this job sustainable for you as a single mother. Alyssa's breath hitched. She hadn't expected anything. She hadn't wanted anything except respect. Yet, this offer startled her in a way she couldn't process. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Becca whispered beside her, earning a small shaking laugh from a few staff members. But Richard wasn't finished. Fourth, he said, I will be setting up an education fund for your daughter. Alyssa froze completely, her chest tightening with shock so sudden she nearly lost her balance. Sir, that's too much. It's not, he said firmly. It's what should be done when someone like you demonstrates the kind of resilience that inspires an entire room. He looked around at the staff and customers. Tonight wasn't just about conflict. It was about a woman who refused to be stepped on. A woman who showed this restaurant what dignity looks like. He faced Alyssa again. Your daughter deserves to see what her mother did tonight, reflected in tangible support. The room grew still, not with tension, but with something warmer, deeper. Respect, admiration, gratitude, even the guests felt it. The man from table 7 stood and extended a hand toward Alyssa. You earned all of this, he said. People like her win too rarely. The woman from table 10 added, your daughter will be proud of you. We all are. Alyssa pressed a hand against her chest, overwhelmed by the swell of emotion rising inside her. I thank you, she managed. Thank you all. Becca threw her arms around her in a sudden embrace. You deserve every part of this, she murmured. Marco leaned in with a grin. Might as well tell you now, we were never letting you quit. Dean approached with a rare smile, placing a hand on Alyssa's shoulder. Welcome to the Beaumont, he said, for real this time. And for the first time since she walked through the doors earlier that evening, Alyssa believed him. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She had become the backbone of something bigger. By the next morning, the Beaumont was already trending, not because of a celebrity sighting or a viral dish or a glamorous gala, but because of a confrontation that had unfolded between a powerful millionaire's wife and a new server who refused to be humiliated. At first, the story spread through small, interconnected pockets of Los Angeles restaurant workers, servers from neighboring establishments, hospitality managers who whispered to one another in break rooms. But within hours, the whispers became posts, the posts became threads, and the threads lit up the internet like a fuse catching flame. A guest from table 10 had written a detailed account of everything she witnessed, describing Alyssa's composure in the face of cruelty and the entire staff's unity after years of fear. A man from table 7 uploaded a short clip he had taken after the confrontation, just moments after Richard escorted Victoria out. The clip didn't show the confrontation itself, only Alyssa standing tall, the staff gathering behind her, and customers rising to their feet. But even that was enough. Comments flooded in, this is what courage looks like. Where can I tip this woman? Finally, someone stood up to a Karen on steroids. I wish I had been as strong when a customer threatened me. By noon, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines appeared across social media feeds. Server at elite La restaurant stands up to billionaire's wife, staff unite behind her. The Beaumont incident sparks national conversation on service worker abuse. Local journalists contacted the restaurant nonstop, requesting interviews with staff, with management, with Alyssa. Dean turned down every request without even asking her. "You've been through enough," he said. "Let them tell the story without turning you into a spectacle." But even without interviews, the story spread. Former employees from dozens of restaurants commented online, sharing their own experiences, some with customers who threw tantrums because their drinks were too cold, some who were fired after refusing to tolerate verbal abuse, some who left the industry entirely because their dignity eroded one shift at a time. Then came the hashtag A Stand With Alyssa. It appeared first on a small service worker forum, but within hours it was reposted by celebrities, activists, chefs, influencers, and everyday people across the country who knew what it felt like to endure disrespect for the sake of a paycheck. Videos poured in, servers reenacting toxic customer interactions, bartenders sharing horror stories, cooks recounting degrading behavior. The tone wasn't bitter, it was cathartic. Alyssa had given people permission to express what they had been suppressing. But the most unexpected part of the story was what people said the moment at the Beaumont represented a shift in power. Not a rebellion, not a riot, but a collective refusal to tolerate cruelty as part of the job. Even high-profile restaurateurs weighed in. One posted, "Protect your staff. Customers are not always right. Respect is non-negotiable." Another wrote, "I want an Alyssa Parker working for me. Strong, composed, professional." A well-known chef in New York declared he would implement new policies to prevent harassment from customers in his establishments. A hospitality union tweeted, "Alyssa didn't just stand up for herself, she stood up for all of us." When Alyssa arrived for her next shift, the restaurant buzzed with an energy she didn't recognize: hopeful, alive, forward, moving. Staff greeted her with smiles that reached their eyes. The hostess brought her a cup of coffee with a shy grin. "You re-trending," she said. Alyssa nearly choked. "I what?" "Trending," Marco repeated as he walked by, brandishing his phone like a trophy. "You everywhere. You inspiring the entire industry." Alyssa pressed a hand to her forehead. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. That's why it happened," Becca said gently. "You acted for the right reasons." Throughout the day, calls poured in from local organizations. A workers' rights nonprofit requested she speak at a panel about fair treatment in the service industry. A community college asked if she'd participate in a hospitality workshop. A journalist from a major newspaper emailed Dean requesting comment for a full-length feature. Richard even stopped by, not as a businessman, but as a human being wanting to ensure she was coping with the whirlwind she had unintentionally sparked. "If it gets overwhelming," he said, "I'll support whatever you choose. Interviews, no interviews, speaking up, staying private. You decide. No one gets to pressure you." That night, as tables filled with customers eager to show support, Alyssa moved through the dining room with her usual calm professionalism. Some guests recognized her and smiled, some whispered admiration. Some left notes on receipts, said things like, "Thank you for standing up for all of us who never could." Others simply treated her with genuine respect, which was all she ever wanted. But something more meaningful was happening inside the staff. They weren't just proud of her, they were empowered. For years they had endured torment under Victoria's unpredictable presence. Now, the fear was gone. They spoke openly about boundaries, about values, about their right to refuse mistreatment. Dean implemented new protocols: zero tolerance for customer abuse, clear reporting procedures, mental health resources, scheduled team meetings where concerns could be voiced without judgment. And every time someone said she changed everything, they meant Alyssa. Yet Alyssa didn't let the praise inflate her ego. She went home each night, tucked her daughter into bed, did chores, prepared lunches, and felt grateful for stability. When her daughter asked why people were calling Mommy a hero, Alyssa knelt beside her and said, "I just did the right thing, sweetheart." And sometimes doing the right thing matters more than you think. A week later, a local news station did a feature called Humanity and Hospitality: The Beaumont Standoff. They blurred out customers' faces, avoided naming Victoria directly, and focused instead on the message the culture had to change. They ended with a single quote from Alyssa that Dean had allowed them to publish: "Respect shouldn't depend on your job title." That line alone went viral. Before long, other restaurants around the country reported shifts in their culture management, taking employee complaints more seriously, customers receiving warnings for abusive behavior, Owners putting up signs that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to those who mistreat our staff." Alyssa hadn't planned to become a symbol. She hadn't prepared for it. She hadn't even sought it. But sometimes, symbols aren't chosen, they emerge when someone chooses integrity over comfort. And that's what she had done. She didn't become famous. She became respected. She didn't become a celebrity. She became a catalyst. And across America, in restaurants big and small, people whispered with hope in their voices, "Be an Alyssa." Victoria Harrington had never experienced the aftermath of her own behavior before. She was always the storm, never the wreckage. But after the night at the Beaumont, everything began to unravel faster than she could assemble a lie to cover it. The moment she and Richard walked out of the restaurant, she tried to regain control, scolding him, gaslighting him, insisting he had embarrassed her, claiming everyone inside had exaggerated the situation. But Richard didn't engage. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply got into the car, told the driver to take them home, and stared out the window like a man carrying a truth he wished he could unhear. And that more than any rebuttal terrified her, because Richard's silence wasn't indifference. It was disappointment. The next morning, the ripples hit her. She woke to dozens of missed calls, a flood of unread messages, and a prayer assistant leaving frantic voicemails. Her name wasn't trending directly, but people had figured out enough to write articles about a powerful La socialite notorious for abusing service workers. Comment sections tore into her with brutal accuracy. "Sounds like the same woman who berated the valet last month. Is this the lady who screamed at a barista for spelling her name wrong?" People like her think money gives them a license to be monsters. The worst part wasn't the exposure. It was the consistency. Story after story poured out from strangers, people she didn't even remember offending. A receptionist she once insulted. A hotel employee she reduced to tears. A makeup artist she accused of sabotaging her. She wanted to dismiss all of them as exaggerations, fabrications, jealousy, but she couldn't ignore that they all resembled the exact critique Richard had spoken the night before. Her phone rang again. Her mother. She let it go to voicemail. Then her therapist. No, not her therapist, the one she paid for show and never actually listened to. Then her personal assistant, who finally texted, "Do you need anything? Real help? I can find a specialist." That word help gnawed at her. Victoria Harrington never needed help. She demanded, she commanded, she controlled. Help implied vulnerability. And vulnerability was something she had buried deep, decades ago, long before she became the polished, intimidating woman the world saw. But the unraveling didn't stop. Richard avoided her for 2 days, staying late at the office or retreating to his study when she attempted to corner him. Their home, usually buzzing with luxurious distractions, felt like a museum, cold, echoing. Too big for two people who no longer knew how to exist around each other. When he finally confronted her, his voice was calm, a chingly calm. "Victoria, I'm not leaving you," he began. "But I won't live like this anymore. And I won't let you treat people the way you treated Alyssa." She rolled her eyes, scoffing. "You were exaggerating." The girl was dramatic. She was composed. He corrected. "You were out of control." She bristled. "So you believe strangers over your own wife?" "I believe patterns," he said simply. "And you've left a trail of them." His eyes softened, but only slightly. "You need help, real help." The word stabbed again. She couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't rationalize her way out of the sting his tone delivered. She retreated to their bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection. She looked flawless, perfect makeup, sculpted features, impeccable hair, yet none of it hid the truth she could no longer outrun. She didn't recognize the person staring back. Her reflection almost seemed to ask, "Is this who you wanted to become?" Hours passed before she finally dialed the number her assistant had texted. It belonged to a highly respected trauma, specialized therapist known for working with women in high-pressure social environments. Victoria hated the idea, hated the vulnerability, hated surrendering control, but she hated feeling hollow more. Her first session was brutal. The therapist, Dr. Lane, didn't coddle her. "Tell me why you're here," she said plainly. Victoria crossed her legs and lifted her chin defiantly. "My husband thinks I need to work on my behavior." "Do you agree, Dr. Lane asked. The question pierced through her defenses. "I don't know," Victoria whispered. Dr. Lane nodded. "That's a start." Over the next weeks, therapy peeled her open in ways she hadn't prepared for. Dr. Lane asked questions she had avoided her entire life. "When did you first feel unheard? When my father ignored everything I said unless it benefited him. When did you first feel powerless? When my mother told me crying made me weak. When did you begin to hurt others instead of letting them hurt you? Victoria's throat closed. She answered with a single, trembling word: high school. She hadn't realized how much resentment she carried. How much fear. How much unchecked anger lived beneath the diamonds and designer labels. She learned that domination wasn't confidence, it was armor. Harshness wasn't strength, it was protection. Cruelty wasn't power, it was a shield against anyone seeing how fragile she truly felt. But understanding her behavior didn't erase the consequences of it. News outlets continued covering the Beaumont incident, and while they never named her publicly, friends and associates recognized the descriptions. Invitations to social events slowed. Charity boards quietly removed her name from committees. People avoided her at gatherings. She didn't blame them. For the first time, isolation felt deserved. One night after a particularly raw therapy session, where she admitted she had never felt loved without condition, she broke down completely in Richard's study. He found her curled on the leather couch, mascara streaked, breath heaving unevenly. She didn't posture or argue. She just whispered, "I don't know how to be different." Richard knelt beside her and held her hand. "Then let someone teach you," he said. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't romance. It was something far more valuable: hope. She committed to change after that, not out of fear, not out of prayer necessity, not to regain status, but because she finally saw the trail of hurt she'd left behind. She reached out to her assistant and apologized for years of condescension. She visited the coffee shop, whose barista she once berated, and left an anonymous but heartfelt letter. She offered bonuses to the hotel staff she had mistreated. She did the hardest thing of all: she sent a letter to the Beaumont, addressed to the entire staff. She didn't excuse anything. She didn't justify her behavior. She simply wrote "I was wrong. I hurt you. I am trying to become someone who doesn't." She didn't expect forgiveness. That wasn't the point. Her transformation didn't make headlines. Alyssa's courage did. But in quiet corners of Los Angeles, in therapy rooms, in handwritten letters, in slow and humbling growth, something remarkable happened. Victoria began becoming a person she had never been allowed to be: human. 3 months after the night that changed everything, the Beaumont thrived in a way no one imagined possible. Reservations were booked weeks in advance, not because of scandal, but because the restaurant had become a symbol of respect, an establishment known for standing by its workers. Customers treated staff with more patience, more warmth, more humanity. The atmosphere was healthier, lighter, even joyful. Alyssa settled into her full-time role with confidence she never knew she possessed. She had become not just a server but a quiet leader, someone her coworkers turned to for advice, encouragement, and strength. Her daughter thrived too, benefiting from the new education fund Richard had arranged. For the first time in years, Alyssa didn't wake up worrying about rent. She woke up grateful, determined, and hopeful. Victoria, meanwhile, had slipped from public view. Not in shame, but in a deliberate attempt to rebuild herself away from the personas she once performed. Therapy carved open wounds she didn't know she carried, and healing them was slow, painful, unpredictable. She cut down her social schedule. She practiced humility in small, uncomfortable steps. She apologized to people she had wronged, not for redemption, but because it was necessary. Richard and she attended couples therapy together, and though their marriage remained strained, they were learning a new way of communicating, one grounded in honesty instead of fear. And yet, one final thing lingered in Victoria's mind. A loose thread she had avoided pulling. A person she had hurt more than she wanted to admit. The woman who had been the catalyst for everything: Alyssa. For 3 months, she considered approaching her. She wrote and rewrote drafts of a letter that never left her desk. She thought about calling the restaurant but couldn't bring herself to impose. Then one afternoon, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Lane said something that unsettled her deeply. Avoidance is another form of self-protection. But sometimes the only way to move forward is to acknowledge the person we harmed the most. Victoria knew she was right, and so, for the first time in her life, she set aside pride, fear, and ego. She drove herself to the Beaumont without makeup, without diamonds, without the armor she used to wear like a second skin. Inside the restaurant, Alyssa was reviewing table assignments near the host stand when the door opened. She looked up, and her breath hitched, not from fear, but from shock. Victoria stood there, hands clasped awkwardly, shoulders slightly hunched, posture unexpectedly human, not polished, not imposing, just present. Dean appeared beside Alyssa immediately. "Do you want me to escort her out?" he asked under his breath. Alyssa shook her head gently. "No. It's okay." She stepped forward. Victoria swallowed hard, her voice trembling in a way Alyssa had never heard. "May I speak with you a moment?" Alyssa nodded. "Of course." They moved to a quiet corner of the restaurant, away from guests but still in view of staff just in case. Victoria took a breath deep, steadying. "I want to say something I should have said months ago." Alyssa didn't respond, giving her space to speak. "I was cruel to you. I was wrong. And nothing in my life, nothing I've been through, nothing I could claim or justify gives me the right to treat you the way I did." She looked down, ashamed. "You didn't deserve any of it. Not the comments, not the threats, not the attack on your personal life." Alyssa held her posture calm but grounded. "You hurt a lot of people here," she said softly. "Not just me." Victoria nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm really trying to understand why I became that person. But understanding doesn't erase the damage." Her voice cracked. "All I can do is apologize and work every day to be different." Alyssa studied her carefully. The woman standing before her wasn't the tyrant who once demanded she eat a customer's meal. This was someone stripped of power, stripped of entitlement, stripped of armor. A woman facing the consequences of her own reflection. "I appreciate you coming," Alyssa said. "It takes strength to admit you were wrong." Victoria blinked rapidly, surprised not by the words, but by the gentleness in them. "I don't expect forgiveness," she whispered. "I just didn't want the last version of me you saw to be the worst one." Alyssa breathed in slowly. "People can change," she said. "If they want to." Victoria nodded. "I do." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Alyssa extended her hand, not as friends, not as equals defined by status, but as two human beings who had shared a painful, transformative experience. Victoria hesitated, then took it. Their handshake was brief but sincere. When they let go, something in the air shifted again, not the sharp tension of their first encounter, but a gentle release. Before leaving, Victoria looked back once more. "Alyssa, yes, thank you," she said, "for standing up for yourself, for standing up to me. You forced me to see what I had become, and I needed that more than I understood." Alyssa offered a small, warm smile. "I hope you find peace." Victoria's eyes glistened. "I'm trying." She left quietly, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Alyssa stood still for a moment, letting everything sink in. Dean approached cautiously. "You okay?" Alyssa nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think we both are." As she returned to her shift, the staff looked at her with admiration, not because she had defeated Victoria months ago, but because of how she handled her now, with strength, grace, and the same calm that had changed everything the night it all began. Later that night, when Alyssa tucked her daughter into bed, she realized something unexpected. She had always believed courage was found in confrontation, in standing firm against a bully. But now she understood a deeper truth. Courage was also found in compassion, in letting people grow, in allowing healing to replace hatred. Victoria drove home with a lighter heart than she'd had in years. Not because she was forgiven, but because she had faced the person she once wounded most and survived. It marked a turning point in her transformation, a step toward becoming someone she herself could finally live with. Their lives moved forward on separate paths, shaped by the same night, forever changed by each other. And the Beaumont, where it all began, became not just a restaurant, but a reminder that dignity, once defended, can inspire change far beyond its walls. The story of Alyssa and Victoria reveals a powerful truth about human dignity and the unseen battles that shape the way people move through the world. At its heart, the narrative reminds us that respect is not a privilege granted by status, but a right that every person deserves, no matter their income, their uniform, or their job title. Alyssa's journey shows how strength does not always appear in loud expressions or explosive defiance. Sometimes it emerges in the unwavering calm of someone who refuses to surrender their self-worth, even when standing in the shadow of someone wealthier, louder, or socially untouchable. Her choice to remain grounded without aggression, without submission, demonstrates that the most transformative acts of courage often come from simply refusing to be diminished. In her steadiness, she offered something rare, a reminder that integrity can topple even the most intimidating facades. Yet the deeper lesson of this story is not just about Alyssa's bravery, it is about the collective awakening that followed. People often underestimate how much change can stem from a single moment of truth spoken without fear. At the Beaumont, Alyssa's refusal to be treated as less than human unshackled an entire staff who had been operating under years of quiet oppression. Her stance became the spark that illuminated the weight everyone had been carrying, and in doing so, she gave them permission to reclaim their voices. The staff's unity is a lesson in solidarity. When one person stands up, it becomes easier for others to stand beside them. The shift was not just emotional, it was structural. It reshaped workplace culture, highlighted the urgent need for boundaries in service industries, and revealed how people thrive when the expectation of endurance is replaced with a guarantee of protection. Alyssa reminded them that fear loses its power when confronted with collective courage. The story also offers a sobering lesson about the nature of cruelty and the broken roots from which it often grows. Victoria was not redeemed through punishment or public humiliation. Rather, her transformation began when the world finally held a mirror to her behavior. For years, she weaponized her pain, projecting her insecurity and unhealed wounds onto others, because it was easier than examining the emptiness inside herself. That is the tragedy of unchecked power. Those who possess it are often the ones least capable of recognizing the damage they inflict. But the moment Victoria's entitlement collided with Alyssa's resolve, her illusion of superiority cracked. And when her husband, Richard, refused to shield her from accountability, she was forced, perhaps for the first time, to confront herself without filters. Her breakdown was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her humanity. She learned that change is not a decision made in a single moment, but a continuous commitment to unbecoming the person life shaped her into. Her path proves that even the ones who cause harm can choose redemption, but only if they are willing to dismantle the walls they built to protect themselves from their own vulnerability. Perhaps the most meaningful lesson lies in the parallel between both women. Alyssa and Victoria lived on opposite sides of society, one fighting for stability, the other drowning in privilege. But both were shaped by forces they never asked for. Alyssa's resilience was forged through hardship. Victoria's cruelty was forged through neglect. Their collision was inevitable, but it ultimately became healing for both. Alyssa discovered her own strength, not in surviving but in leading. Victoria discovered her own brokenness, not in weakness but in admitting truth. Their final encounter, calm, honest, stripped of power, reveals the story's emotional core. Forgiveness is not always reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness is simply the act of letting go, allowing both people to walk forward without carrying the past like a chain around their necks. In the end, it was not about two women at war, it was about two women learning who they truly were. The broader message speaks to anyone who has ever felt small in the face of authority, or anyone who has ever misused their own. It teaches that courage is contagious, that compassion is transformative, and that accountability is not cruelty, it is an act of care. The Beaumont became a symbol of what can happen when people stop accepting disrespect as part of the job and start valuing their own worth. Alyssa's story resonated because it didn't rely on grand gestures. It relied on one simple, universal truth: people deserve kindness. And when kindness is missing, dignity must take its place. The world changed for Alyssa the moment she decided she was no longer going to absorb someone else's brokenness. The world changed for Victoria the moment someone finally told her enough. And the world changed for everyone watching, because a single act of integrity has the power to rip through complacency and reveal the possibility of something better. Ultimately, the story teaches that change often begins with one person refusing to continue the cycle. One person deciding that fear is no longer acceptable. One person choosing honesty over comfort. Change starts small, but it ripples outward into workplaces, into homes, into communities. Alyssa believed she was simply doing her job. Instead, she became the catalyst for transformation, the reminder that dignity has a backbone, and the proof that standing up for yourself can inspire others to stand up for themselves too. And maybe the most important lesson is this: strength isn't about winning the battle. Strength is about walking through it without losing who you are. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, Feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.